Hey, 7th and 8th grade, we're going to continue on chapter 23, Which Way America. We are talking about the 1980s right now. And we were right in the middle of talking about new inventions, specifically for computers and also for medicine. Let's finish up with biotechnology. This is a scientific alteration of genetic structure of plants, animals, and humans. And the whole purpose of this was to create a more a product that was going to be a little less prone to disease. Biotechnology. Okay, laser technology became a practical tool in medicine, industry, and the military. So the idea of using lasers to have a very controlled hand when trying to remove something, but also to create like a missiles program. I mean, so laser technology was used in a variety of different ways here. I'm going to go back just a little bit for people because I really hit off that note fast, and I want to go back so people can write it real quick. So everybody's got this one. Here's biotech. Okay. Okay, moving on. Computers transformed homes in the 1980s. Appliances began to think with teeny tiny computer chips, monitoring temperature, speed, and other factors in everything from dishwashers to microwave ovens, cars, and washing machines. And really the late 70s, early 80s is when almost everybody was starting to get brand new microwaves. It was new technology. Everybody was pretty excited about it. And everybody burned a lot of popcorn before popcorn or microwave popcorn became a thing. I tell you, people really wanted to try that. And out of necessity came microwave popcorn. But you'll notice this one has like 2 disk drives. It's got everything kind of set up. It's very bulky compared to today's computers, but it's a lot less bulky than the previous generation of computers. Remote controls. These became a really big thing in the 80s. Before that, everybody jokes that the remote control was the kids of the family. They had to go and actually turn a knob. Or when cable first came out, I know you guys are looking at me like cable has, what's cable? We don't even use cable anymore. Okay, when cable first came out, it was a way to get multiple stations. People would even have a long box that had buttons along the top of it, and you pushed the buttons on that. But there was a cord going from that box to the television set. So now we have remote controls, meaning you could control it remotely. You didn't have to be attached to it. It's wireless. These are going to be used to open garage doors. I know, shocking. Lawn sprinklers. Select and record television programs on videotapes, which honestly in the early 80s was not even a thing. Okay, people getting a chance to record on VHS wasn't until really the very late 80s. Okay, it wasn't early on. It took a long time for people to actually get VHSs. VHS is the big cassette tapes that go into a player, and you can watch movies off of them. You guys are young. Okay, so here's the thing. Before that, if you wanted to watch a movie on one of those big cassettes, most people didn't have a VCR. They instead had to go to this is so far back. They had to go to a store that rented the videos, and they had to actually rent the VCR as well. And it came in like a little suitcase, like bigger than a briefcase, about the same size as like a computer bag today. And you took that home and you opened that case, you connected cables to the back of your television, and then you could play the video. And then you could rent quite a few videos and borrow or rent the machine and then take it back like the next day or 2 days later. It didn't take long for people to start clamoring for an affordable VCR, because really up until about 1987, they weren't affordable. They were $300-400 a pop. And usually most people don't really get into buying something like that for their home until it gets to under $100. So it's going to take a long time for that to take off, but relatively short when we talk about history. But we're going to see for the first time remote controls being used for videotapes, and also even to check telephone answering machines. Also becoming popular, and this is going to take a long time as well, cellular phones, even though the technology had been there since the 20s. So now cellular phones, fax machines, where it kind of works like a copier, but it sends the image that's on a piece of paper across phone lines to another machine. And then PCs, this is a personal computer. Okay, so there is a really, really old movie out there called War Games, where you can see what an original home personal computer would have looked like. It's huge, okay? And it's going to be much later before we get this kind of PC. Most people didn't really use their PCs at home for anything other than business, working things out, until computer games were invented and went from being on a console that was hooked up to TV to something you could buy on a disc and could go directly into your computer. Robotics, new science that produced machines that could handle hazardous chemicals, assemble everything from cars to computers, lift goods on assembly lines, and package them for shipment. There's good in this and some bad in this. The good was it can do all that stuff. The bad in it is it did make it harder for people to get those jobs now, because their job was replaced by a computerized machine, by a robot. The way it should work out is that if a company is able to afford this kind of robotics to replace the human factor, you should be able to increase your productivity so you have another place for those human beings to work. That's not always the way it works out, though, because it's really hard, especially for people who work at a job that doesn't require a lot of training, but they are important to that job because they repeat the job over and over and over again. Like, for instance, when it comes to assembly lines for cars, they're doing really one job over and over again, but they're not really, it takes a few hours to train to do that one job. If they're let go, they leave that job without really any kind of training in anything else, and that can be a problem. Automation, this is what we're talking about right here when we talk about automotive assembly line. Automation is the process of increasing efficiency through the use of self-regulating machines. So the machines actually build the majority of the cars, where before it was human beings. Again, this can be very beneficial because the cost of the car goes down, but it can be rather harmful because now all the people who were making the cars are now out of work. They should be finding jobs because of the fact that the company can sell more cars, and so they have more money for development and research, but the people who were making the cars don't have the training to go into those new jobs. That's the problem. So it really comes up to businesses needing to train their workers on multiple levels and in multiple areas. Satellite dishes. Yep. People were excited about these. These were used in telecommunication satellites in space. You could bounce a signal off of a satellite in space, and that allowed, okay, get this. Let's think about this for a moment. Billions of dollars to get satellites into space orbiting around the Earth. And people's biggest excitement about this was the fact that they could access the signals from those space satellites in their own backyard so they could watch more channels on television. Woo! Okay, so this allowed, it enabled the average American to access live television broadcasts from around the world. And they were about that big. That's a personal one. That's not even a business one. This is a personal satellite dish. Now the satellite dishes are about the size of an actual dish, a dinner plate. But yeah, this was a thing. Now, most people didn't have satellite dishes. They opted for cable instead. Okay, that's going to be something. Fiber optics. This is laser beams traveling down thin glass threads. They can carry thousands of telephone signals, television broadcasts, or computer information. They're very beneficial, but also very expensive. And they would have to replace all of the original cables with this fiber optics, which is also very expensive. So they're still being used and still being, brought in. They have to replace things a little bit at a time. New information superhighway began to develop, linking the home, the office, laboratory, and factory to all manner of services and information. You call it the internet. It actually started as a government program so that bases could talk to each other, but it was soon made available to the average folks. And this is what it looked like back in the day. You had to use your phone line to get onto the internet. So you have a phone right next to this computer, and you've got this dialing up process. Your phone had to connect, your computer had to connect to the phone line. It would make this really awful noise for the modem. And then it was incredibly, incredibly slow because you were trying to put a lot of information through those phone lines, those really, older cables. And so it took a long time for anything to download and for any kind of communication to take place. You could start your computer, go make a sandwich, come back, push a button, go, make dessert, come back, and finally get on. It took forever. And then on top of that, if you were on your computer, people couldn't call you on your phone because your phone line was tied up to your computer. So the American citizen is now, even with the slower streaming of data, now it's so fast, it's instantaneous, it's crazy to us. But the American citizen was now influenced more than ever by the power of electronic media. Many people describe the new era of technology as the information age. We had the Stone Age, the Iron Age, the Bronze Age. I put those out of order. And now we have the information age. Really fascinating. And all of this comes from basic data that is coded in ones and zeros. Okay. So we are more influenced ever before, even in the 80s. If you really want to have a good laugh, just watch some movies from the 80s about computers, and you'll just look at them and go, why are they so big? Why are they so slow? Why is he using his phone? Okay. In 1981, NASA launched the first space shuttle. This was going to be huge. This is, for the first time, a reusable space plane. Before this, they put the spacecraft on a rocket, flew it into space, and then basically that module that the astronauts were in would dispose of the rocket once it ran out of fuel. And when it came time to come back into the Earth's atmosphere, they would just kind of do a controlled drop into the ocean. This would prevent from all this one-use rocketry. Instead, you have the space shuttle, which would go up as a rocket, be piloted around in space, and then return to the Earth like a plane. It's kind of cool. The space shuttle program thrived for 5 years. 5 years. And then their next big push was they were going to send up an average citizen on the Challenger. And so they did basically an open contest of who would like to go up on the Challenger. And the woman who won that contest was a civilian teacher named Christine McCullough. And her students were so excited about her being able to go onto this Challenger. She was excited. She trained as an astronaut to go on it. And unfortunately, it just went all to pieces. I shouldn't have said it that way, but the space shuttle program thrived. In 1986, when the Challenger took off, it exploded almost immediately. As soon as it got into the lower atmosphere, after it was launched, it exploded. So everybody was watching it because it's the first time a civilian is going up into space. And all of a sudden, it's like, poof, everything explodes. And after that, people just kind of put a hold on the space shuttle program until they could figure out exactly what had happened during that and to fix whatever problems were there. But it was a tragedy in American history. It must have just absolutely crushed her students and her family. Okay, the Reagan Doctrine. This was the belief that one should stop communism before it could attack and enslave a country. So he was looking at peace through strength, and it sounds really familiar because we talked recently about Theodore Roosevelt, whose big motto was speak softly and carry a big stick. This is really the same kind of idea that Reagan is going to have. They're both Republican presidents. It makes sense that they would echo each other. So one, speak softly, carry a big stick, have peace, but show that you are willing to fight, and then peace through strength. Okay, same kind of idea. The Solidarity movement was going on in Europe. Poland had gotten its independence after World War I. It had its independence for about 20 years. During that time, they were just struggling to become their own nation. Really, that was all their goal. They were building new facilities. They were trying to educate themselves. They were really pushing in this new realm of independence for their nation. So they're a brand new baby country. And then World War II broke out, and they got demolished by getting caught in a pincher movement between Germany and Russia. The two of them signed an agreement that they would go through Poland in a blitzkrieg or a lightning war very quickly and just destroy everything in their path. And then they would split the Polish land into two pieces. Well, after Germany lost World War II, that land was actually given to one of our allies, one of the allies' nations, Russia. Russia, after it broke with Hitler, after the Polish invasion, Hitler tried to attack Russia. Russia broke from Hitler at that point, joined the Allies, and so they were allies to us, and they were given the Polish land. It was completely unfair. It was a betrayal of the trust of the Polish people, and there was still a Polish government at the time. It wasn't like they didn't have a government. They did. They were just living outside of Poland at the time because Poland had been conquered by Germany. And so the Free Polish government found itself completely locked out of the negotiations, and they were betrayed by the United States, Great Britain, and France when it came down to it. Instead, the Polish people were foisted over onto Stalin. He took them over. So now Poland is belonging to Russia. They're part of the USSR, but there were Polish nationalists, people who were Polish but didn't want to be controlled by this outside government. They decided to start standing up to the tyranny of Soviets in their land. They did not want to be communists. They didn't want to be controlled by the Russians. They wanted to have independence again. And Reagan is going to be completely and totally on their side for this. Now, martial law was the response of the communists to the Solidarity movement. Communists rounded up members of the Solidarity movement to be imprisoned, tortured, and executed. It looks like a really old picture. It's actually a current picture of, a contemporary picture from when this happened. It's just from like newspaper or black and white magazine article. Reagan denounced the action of the Russians and instead expressed support for solidarity. So here is an American president saying, I am on the side of the people who are rebelling against the tyranny of the country who actually owns their land at this point. And it was really going and saying, you know what, the United States, we are on the side of the Polish people. He didn't really say anything about the fact that the Polish people had been abandoned or betrayed by a previous president. Instead, he's saying it's time for them to get their freedom back. So here he is, a picture taken of him when he was doing a radio interview or a radio address on his ranch in Santa Barbara, California. He lived in California and Washington, D.C. during the time of his presidency, and he would often go to California to this ranch where he would do work on his own away from everybody else, and gave him a chance to kind of rest and relax between all of the travel and all the work he had to do in Washington. So here he is in a radio address from his ranch, October 9th, 1982, announcing trade sanctions against Poland in retaliation for the outlawing of Solidarity. Now, the sanctions against Poland are against Poland's communist government, which are actually run by the Russians. And he was angry at them for outlawing Solidarity, this movement that was trying to get independence. In 1983, Reagan learned that Cuban dictator Fidel Castro planned to take over the island nation of Grenada in the West Indies. He was going to use that as a military base to invade the mainland of South America. That was the goal. The information got to the president, and the president's like, we're not going to let that happen. So Fidel Castro, who had taken over all of Cuba and had been there for quite a few years now, was now looking to expand his territory and go into South America. So he sent people to the island of Grenada. So to prevent full-fledged communist invasion, President Reagan sent American troops to Grenada to defend the people. He didn't invade Cuba because that had been a promise from JFK that we would never ever invade or try to overthrow communist dictatorship in Cuba. So instead, the president sends troops to Grenada to defend the people there. And we were not even like super tied to Grenada at the time. We were allies, but we didn't have anything really pulling us there except for here was a group of people that were about to get crushed so that their country become a base so that this Cuban dictator, this communist dictator, could take off and take over South America. This was trying to stop that before it ever happened. So the United States and armed forces from neighboring islands quickly rounded up the advance guard of Cubans and shipped them back to Cuba. Didn't hold them prisoner, didn't make a prisoner of war camp or anything, just shipped them back to Cuba. They saved Grenada and the continent of South America from communist invasion. President Reagan sent 50 military advisors to El Salvador to prevent a communist takeover there. Communism and socialism have been a long problem for the people of South America because the information sounds great on paper, but it actually hurts people in the long run. But it's amazing how many people don't want to admit that communism and socialism aren't a good idea. Okay, Stinger missiles. This is a brand new kind of U.S. weapon. It was used by Afghanistan to help the freedom fighters there to resist Soviet forces. There was a long war between Afghanistan and the USSR. So Russia, the USSR, the leader, they wanted Afghanistan for what they could get out of the land. They were looking for natural resources. They were looking for new tax money coming in. They wanted to take over Afghanistan and then hopefully take over countries around Afghanistan. But the Afghani people took to the hills, literally took to the hills. They lived in caves, they lived in the mountains, and they fought from there. They also lived in beautiful cities. Don't get me wrong, they're not just a bunch of people who live in hills and everything, but they also had lived in cities. There were people who lived in those cities who were on the Russian side and some who were on the independent side. There was an Afghan leader who was really like a prince in Afghanistan who was still leading his people. But the United States, even though we weren't actually involved in this war, we did sell weapons to Afghanistan to help them defend themselves against Russian invasion. Many Muslim terrorists were being trained in Libya, and that's in the north part of Africa. That's where a dictator named Muammar al-Gaddafi, he sponsored international terrorism. He wanted to be really close friends with the other dictators in the Middle East and to eventually take over the world. Now, the best way to do that if you don't have a huge army or huge military is by using terrorism. So just quick little bomb drops or suicide bombers or bombs planted in certain areas just to cause fear so that you can kind of get a toehold into these different areas. And so the dictator who's in North Africa, Muammar Gaddafi, he opened his territory, his country, so that terrorists from all over the Middle East could come and train there. And this is very well known. In 1986, there was a bomb that exploded near an American military base in West Berlin, nowhere near North Africa. But this bomb that was in a nightclub in West Berlin, right next to a military base, it was a club that it was known for having American military men going and visiting. It ended up killing one American soldier and wounding 50 other people. Reagan did some quick investigations and discovered that Gaddafi was behind that attack and many others where it was just strategically placed bombs that went off and hurt or killed or basically terrorized people. So his response was to send American warplanes to bomb targets in Libya. That was a huge airstrike. It went from, this guy is planting little bombs in nightclubs. The United States sends warplanes to bomb multiple targets in this man's country as a way of saying, we see what you did. You're not going to do it again. Well, it turns out that a lot of people in the United States, especially people in the media, said that is overkill. Reagan was like, no, it's just enough kill. We don't want our American people or the people that we are allied with, because by this time we're allies with Germany, we don't want people to get hurt and killed because of those who want to push their agenda by terrorist attacks. So we're going to snap back. Okay? He puts a bomb in a nightclub, I bomb his house. Seems fair to me. Now, communist guerrillas are going to make things difficult in other areas. We talked about what was going on in South America. There was a threat of communist takeover there, but there was also a big threat of communist takeover throughout Asia as well. Communist guerrillas made it difficult for the Philippines under their elected president, Ferdinand Marcos. The problem was Ferdinand Marcos was also kind of a corrupt jerk, okay? So we were allied with the Filipino people because from the very beginning, we had helped them get their independence from Spain. We had a long history of sending ambassadors over. We had multiple military bases in the Philippines. We had a strong working relationship with them. But the president that was hired by the Filipino people was incredibly, incredibly corrupt, as was the rest of his government. So the government corruption and the expense of fighting communism led to the fall of the Marcos government. They were spending their money on things for themselves rather than actually protecting their people, and that's going to come out in the 80s. Marcos was allowed to leave. He basically got thrown out of office. Once he was thrown out, he and his wife packed up everything and they took off, and they appealed to the United States and said, is there any place, can we come and live with you guys? We got kicked out because, we spent a lot of government money on ourselves. And the United States said, we'll let you live in Hawaii. We'll let you live on an estate in Hawaii. You have to pay for it, of course, but you can live there as a political exile. So the Filipinos set up a new government under Corazon Aquino in 1986. But the political instability continued because Corazon Aquino, her husband who had been killed while running for president, and she herself were both very socialistic. They were pro-socialism, pro-communism. And so that's going to increase that political instability. Okay. We're going around the world here. In 1986, there was a group of terrorists who were supported by Iran. They seized 6 Americans in Lebanon and held them hostage, telling the United States that they needed to pay money or to give supplies to them in order to see the American hostages released. So Reagan is trying to figure out the best way to release these hostages. And he made an arrangement with them that he would sell arms to them if they would release the hostages. That means he will give them some weapons. Now, they are going to be selling the arms. They're not going to be giving it to them. They're going to be selling. The Central Intelligence Agency, also known as the CIA, who the vice president was at one time the head of the CIA, they arranged to use the proceeds from the sale of those weapons to support Contra freedom fighters in Nicaragua. So the thought process is, okay, Iran has captured 6 Americans. We will open up the store and let them purchase weapons from us. We will then take that money from the purchased weapons and we will use it to help stop communism in South America. That's the whole process there. And that's also our time. So I'm going to stop right on time today. Woo woo. You guys have a wonderful weekend. I will talk to you again on Monday. Have a good weekend. Bye.